invite you to find 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2. If you're going to be using one of our church Bibles, there are hardcover Bibles. If you're using a hardcover Bible, it's page 275. And if you're going to use one of the paperback, page 269. So you find 1 Samuel chapter 2 this morning. I was speaking to a friend of mine who pastors a church in the Iowa City area. This has been a couple years ago. I was having a discussion with him. And as we were talking, he said he had met a family in the community. And the first thing that got my attention when he started telling me this story is he said that this family, this dad in particular that he was talking about, had a son who played for the University of Iowa. Played football for the University of Iowa. And as you can imagine, being a diehard Iowa Hawkeye fan, I thought that my ears perked up. Not that I wasn't listening to his story prior to that, but let's just say I started listening to his story a little closer when he said that this dad that he had met in their community had a son who played football at the University of Iowa. And it was an interesting conversation. He was telling me they were having this back and forth, and this man, as far as he knew, was not a believer. In fact, he told me he was fairly convinced that this man and his family were not believers, and so he was trying to reach out to this family, trying to develop a friendship with this family, was inviting them to different activities at the church, and so he had developed this relationship with this man specifically, but trying to reach out to his family. And during that conversation, the man made a comment that kind of surprised this pastor friend of mine. He said, just out of the blue, he said, "Hey, pastor, did you know that somewhere," he said, I don't know all the details. He said, I heard that my grandpa was a Baptist pastor." And so this pastor thought, well, that's interesting. He said, "Tell me more." The man said, "I wish I could tell you more. I wish I could tell you more." He said, "I don't know a lot of the details." He said, "It's just every now and then during family reunions or whatever, he said, it sticks in my mind that I remember hearing that it was either his grandpa or his great-grandpa was actually a pastor of a church." And so the man said, "I should probably find out some more detail about that." And so the conversation ended, and they went their separate ways. And he said it was about a week later, he ran into this man again in town, and they began to talking. And he said to him, "Do you remember that conversation we had about a week ago? I told you that I had a grandpa or a great-grandpa that was a pastor of a Baptist church here in the area." And he said, "Yeah, geez, I remember that." He said, "Well, I began to ask some questions of my uncles and my mom and different things." And he said, "Sure enough, it's true." He said, my grandpa was a pastor of a Baptist church, and he said the name of the church. Church still exists today. And so he thought, well, this is really interesting, and they began to talk about it. And this pastor, as he's telling me this story, he said, I couldn't help but ask myself this question: where did that faith go? He said, as far as I knew, he said, I was almost convinced talking to this man. They said this family didn't attend church. They didn't see church as a priority. This man didn't talk anything about spiritual things at all. He said, really, he was pretty convinced that this man was not a follower of Jesus Christ. Didn't live for the Lord, didn't desire to live for the Lord, and yet he is told that just, 2 generations before, his father was a pastor. His grandfather was a pastor of a church. And so he didn't obviously say this to this man, but he said it to me as we're having this conversation. He said, that just continued to haunt me. He said, it just continued to bother me. He said, how can faith be lost in just a short amount of time? How can one man be a pastor of a church, be what was believed to be a very strong believer? Doesn't even have to be a pastor, but in this story he was. Be a very strong believer, and then just a couple generations, it's all lost. This man was not a believer. He wasn't a follower of Christ. He said he was a very moral man, very nice man, but he was not a Christian man. And he said that the question just continued to haunt me, he said, how can that happen? And he said, as a father, he was challenged by that. He said, I began to wonder, where will my family be 10 years from now? Where will my family be 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now if the Lord doesn't return? And as he shared that with me a few years ago, I was reading through, in my devotions, I was reading through the Old Testament, and I came across this story in 1 Samuel chapter 2 that we're going to be looking at this morning. And in this story of 1 Samuel chapter 2, there is something very similar to what my friend's acquaintance in Iowa City told him. And that's this. You have a generation, you have faith lost in one generation. Faith lost in one generation. I can be honest with you, I've been a pastor now long enough, I've seen it with my own eyes. Maybe you've seen it with your own eyes. You know people, and you get to know them. Maybe they're people that you know at work, or maybe they're people you know that you go to school with or something, and you know that it was just not many years ago, maybe a generation before them, that they were very committed followers of Jesus Christ, that family went to church, and that church was a priority to them, and their faith was a priority to them. And yet here you are just maybe a generation later talking to this individual where faith isn't really a priority at all. It happens. It happens in our world. It happens within churches. If you're on our text list, and I send out a Saturday night text, kind of give you a little update as to what I'm going to be speaking on the next morning, you saw that I asked that question. Where will your family be in 10 years? And I don't mean where will they be living, what will they be doing for a living. I'm talking spiritually. Where will your family be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now? Will they continue to observe the faith that you observe? Or will they have a conversation someday down the road where maybe they say, I remember my grandparents used to go to LeClaire Baptist Church. Or my grandparents used to be followers of Jesus Christ. My great-grandparents were committed followers of Christ. God forbid, right, that we ever get to that point where our faith is lost within a generation or two. And so we're going to look at this. You know, somebody once told me, the best lessons to learn are from someone else's mistakes. Isn't that true? Wouldn't you much rather learn from someone else's mistakes? You know, we learn from mistakes, right? We make mistakes and make a mental note, oh, okay, don't do that again. But isn't it much less painful when you learn from someone else's mistakes? Let's just be honest. That's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to learn from someone else's mistakes. We're going to look at a story about a family whose faith was lost in one generation. And we're going to learn what not to do by looking at this story, all right? So you're in 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2. And so this morning what I want to do is I want to look at three necessities that must happen if we're going to avoid our faith fading. Or if we're going to avoid the next generation losing faith and faith not being a priority to them anymore. These are three specific necessities that we need to make a priority. And yes, this is Father's Day, and I'm talking specifically to dads today because this is a dad who made a mistake or made several mistakes. But as we talk about this in the context of our family month, let's understand these are things that just families need to do. Families need to understand this and how important this is, and these things are to do. Grandparents, all sorts of things. It's the house, in some translations, this family is referred to as the house of Eli. It's Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. How would you like to go through life with those names? Right? Hophni and Phinehas are their names. And so you're in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And I want to begin by giving you just a little bit of a background of what's going on. We won't dig real deep into this, but Eli was a high priest. In other words, he was a spiritual leader of the day. Eli's family had been chosen by God to be a high priest that serves in the temple, who helps lead the worship of the Israelites. And so Eli is this high priest, and he's serving the Lord. And we're going to see that he made some real mistakes as a father. And let's just say this. He will not be winning Father of the Year anytime soon because of some of the choices he made, some of the decisions that he made. So we're going to learn from his mistakes. First necessity, if we're not going to allow our faith to fade over generations, number one, give consistent godly discipline. Give consistent godly discipline. The outline for my message is on the back of your bulletin, so if you want to follow along where we're at. But let's get a little bit more background of what's going on. I'm going to read some of these verses. And at first, as you read through this, there's a lot of Old Testament worship activities going on here. And so as I read some of these things, your response may be what my response was the first time I read through this passage, and that was basically this. What? What is being said? So let me read these verses, and then let me give you some clarification as what's being said, okay? Beginning in verse 12, 1 Samuel chapter 2, beginning in verse 12 and reading down through verse 17. It says, Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the people that when now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. Okay, now let me stop right there and just say, just stick with me, okay? Because we're talking about pots, and we're talking about forks, and we're talking about meat being boiled. Okay, I'll explain where we're at in this. Pick it up in verse 15. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing. These are Eli's sons, right? The servant of the priest would come and say, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." Verse 16, if the man said to him, "Let the fat be burned up first, then take whatever you want," the servant would then answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I will take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. All right, now, I promised you I'd give you a little bit of clarification of what's going on here. Let me point out a few things first of all. First of all, it says that Eli's sons had no regard for the Lord. No regard at all for the Lord. In other words, they kind of blew God off. They were in a position of spiritual leadership, by the way, because spiritual leadership in those days was passed down through generations. So Eli was a high priest, and so his boys then would be trained to be high priests. And so here they are in position of spiritual authority, but it says about them that they have no regard for the Lord at all. They're kind of blowing God off. They're kind of going through the motions. And it says here that all these verses, it says that they were stealing meat that was being sacrificed to God. Now, in verses 13 and 14, this is what's happening. This is commonplace in verses 13 and 14. Kind of the way the priests were paid back then is there were certain guidelines that you had to go through if you were sacrificing meat on an altar to God. It would go through this whole process. One of the ways that the priests, the spiritual leaders of the day, stick with me, spiritual leaders of the day would be paid was they were given guidelines as to how they were to take some of the offering, and it was to be given to them. And that was okay. That was the way it should be done. That was the way it was set up by God. These priests that's how they would get their food to eat. That's how they continued to live, and that's how they continued to be the leaders in the temple. All right? And so that's what they're doing. They're just doing what they'd been taught to do. That was it. Verses 15 and 16, though, they're going a step further. You see, in the Old Testament law, it was required that the fat was to be burned off of the altar, off of the meat first before it was given in at the altar. And anyway, so they're coming in. All right, let me summarize what's happening here. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are walking in, and they're saying, "Okay, now we're obliged. We're allowed to dip in and get some of this meat." And everyone's going, "Oh yeah, sure. That was the accepted practice of the day. Everything's great." But they're saying, "But we want to do it our way. We want to take it before the fat's been burned off. We want it good. We don't want all these. We're not going to follow these rules. These rules are stupid, and so we want to deal with that." Let me put in terms that you will understand today. It would be as if, and I'm afraid to even say this because I have no intentions to ever do this. Okay, if I do, somebody tackle me or something. It would be as if the offering was taken, and I walked up here when the offering was over, and I took up all the things that were in the offering and stuffed them in my pockets and said, "Thank you. You are dismissed. See you next Sunday." Right? Now, are there things that, get at the risk of getting awkward here, but am I paid as a salary as the pastor of this church? Yeah. And so there are some guidelines where it's been set up where my needs are met, my family's needs are met. But it doesn't allow me just to come up here and just kind of take whatever I want, everything out of the offering, and just stick it in my pockets and say, "Have a good day, see you later, thanks. Come next Sunday, bring your purses, bring your wallets. I'll see you again next Sunday." You wouldn't like that, would you? That wouldn't go over real well. That's what's happening in this passage. Hophni and Phinehas, who are the spiritual leaders of the day, are given some specific guidelines. It's okay for you to do this and this. But they're doing that and that. they're adding to it. They're going beyond what God says is okay. And it says they have no regard for God. God set up these rules. And they're like, "Who cares? we're going to do what we want to do. They have no regard for God. And my first question is, how could this happen? How could that happen? How could two boys who were raised in a high priest family, two boys that are taught what it means to be a high priest, two boys who see the holiness of the temple and what's involved in temple worship at the time in the Old Testament, how could they grow up with it and were being reminded daily, literally daily, of the holiness of God, and yet they're blowing it off? They could care. It says they have no regard for God. And may I say this, that that attitude back in the Old Testament, thankfully not today, back in the Old Testament, that sin was punishable by death. To blaspheme God, to have no regard for God. They could have been put to death for what they did, and well, we'll fast forward and see that that's kind of basically what happens. But how could it happen? I think we get a little bit of an understanding. If you fast forward a little bit, look with me one chapter over, 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3, and I want to start in verse 11 just to get some context. It says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, see, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle." In other words, God's saying, I'm about to do something that's going to get everybody's attention. All right, so just, Samuel, brace yourself. Verse 12, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to... For I told him, God is saying this to Samuel, who is the messenger of God, for I told him, Eli, that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. So here's what God is saying. Okay, Samuel, I want you to pass this message on to the Israelites, but also on to Eli's family. These boys are punished, and it's that knew about it, but he didn't do anything about it. He knew. Again, he says, for I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin that he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. So the first necessity, if we're going to be careful, if we're going to be those who don't allow our faith to fade from one generation to the other, is we need to give consistent godly discipline. And that's what God is saying Eli failed to do. Eli, I think, made the effort to do that. You see that if you read through the passage. He made the effort, but it wasn't consistent. It says by God's words in verse 13 of chapter 3, it says that he knew about it, but he failed to do anything about it. When I lived in Michigan, our senior pastor, I was a youth pastor at the church, our senior pastor had a dog, big dog, golden retriever, I think, named Gideon. I thought that was a great name for a dog, Gideon. And so they bought this dog, and they lived kind of semi out in the country, not really far out in the country, but semi out in the country. So they wanted Gideon to have the freedom to run, because big dog and everything. But they knew that if Gideon just had the freedom just to run, that could get him into some danger. And so they started doing something, and many of you have probably done this or seen people do this. They set up an electric fence around their yard. So Gideon could go outside, and Gideon could run free in their big yard, but Gideon wouldn't go beyond this electric fence. And if you've ever seen that, you know, they wear the collar, they bury the line underneath the ground, and if the collar meets the line, then they get a zap, and that's supposed to teach them they don't go any further. Now, this was really funny because, well, it was funny for me to watch. It probably wasn't funny for Gideon, but our pastor, we were out standing one time out in the backyard, and Gideon was out running around, and Gideon was just getting used to this electric fence. And so he's out and he's running, and he's sniffing around and everything. And my pastor standing next to me, he says, now watch this. I'm going to see if he's going to do this. He said, he's been doing something, and it's amazing. He said, watch. And so Gideon walks right up to where the line is, where he knows he's going to get zapped if he goes any further. He goes right up there, and he stands there, and he's kind of doing this. It's like he's trying to build up courage, right? And he goes like this, and he goes like this, and all of a sudden he steps back a couple steps, and he just runs. And as soon as he hits the collar, hits the where the line is, and he gets jolted, he yelps, but he keeps going. And so the pastor said he's been doing that. It's like he knows that if I can just build up the courage, to just get beyond that line, then I'm free. All right? Now he said, this is where my wife and I differ. He would go over, he'd yell, he went, Gideon. And Gideon would instantly stop when he heard his voice. And so Gideon stops and he sits there and he walks over to Gideon. And our pastor, and some of you are going to think, oh, this is terrible, this is animal cruelty, this is what our pastor would do. Our pastor would go and he'd take Gideon by the collar and bring him back through the line, slowly. And it would zap him again. He said, now my wife would go into the garage and turn off the electric fence and go and get Gideon and bring him in and then turn the electric fence back on. He said, but I want to teach him that there are boundaries. And he says he knows there's a boundary that he shouldn't cross when he leaves. He says, so I want him to also understand there's a boundary you don't cross. You're gonna have the consequences of crossing that boundary not once but twice. Now, why do I say this? Because I think all parents should put a collar on their kids. No, that's not what I'm saying. I just want to see if you're paying attention. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying, though, is parents, we need to set up boundaries with our kids. It says here that Eli didn't set up boundaries. It says he recognized his sons were doing these things, and it says that he didn't confront them. He didn't talk to them about it. He didn't say, hey, wait a minute, these are the boundaries that you're supposed to live within. These are the boundaries you're supposed to live. And he said, that's what is lacking. And parents, that's what we need to do. Dads, that's what we have to do. We need to understand the importance of teaching our kids where their boundaries are, teaching them discipline. And so here's the problem I think that we have sometimes. We get the wrong view in our mind of what the word discipline means. When you hear the word discipline, what do you often think about? You think about spanking, you think about corner, time. Punished to look in chapter 2, beginning in verse 22, it says this. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. And he goes on. He confronts his boys. He confronts them, but he teaches them that he says some things to them, but he never really teaches them consistently. The consistent need for discipline, the consistent need for boundaries. And so the first necessity, if you want to continue the faith that you have, that strong faith that you have, and you want it to pass on to the next generation, you need to consistently give consistent godly discipline to your kids. Let them know where their boundaries are. Biblical boundaries. Don't just come up with arbitrary boundaries. Set biblical boundaries for your kids. This is what we're going to do. Why? Well, because we believe biblically this is what God says. Can I encourage you? When your kids are little, you may have to do this. But if you get older, your kids get older, try to avoid this answer. Why do we do that? Because I said so. I am the first person in line who will tell you your kids should obey you because you say so. Okay? But I'm also will stand first in line and tell you it's always good to let them know why. If they say why, just say, here's why. And have a reason, have a biblical reason why. Because it's not like it gives you more authority. It's simply, if you teach them that I have to obey God and God has boundaries, God gives me boundaries, they'll grow up learning that they have to answer to someone more important than you. You are important, but ultimately you're going to be gone. Ultimately, I'm going to be gone. Our kids need to learn that they don't just answer to mom and dad, but ultimately they have to answer to God. And so when your kids say why, try to give them a biblical reason. In fact, I strongly encourage you to give them a biblical reason. Let's look at number 2. Number 2. See if I can find it in my notes. All right. Teach complete godly discipline. Teach completely godly discipline. Complete godly discipline. Let's pick up the story. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 27. 1 Samuel chapter 22, beginning verse 27. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priests, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites." Finally, verse 29. "Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling?" Now, here's the phrase I want you to notice. Look at the very end, verse 29. "Why do you honor your sons more than me, by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel?" So here's summary of what he's actually saying. It doesn't say who this guy is. This guy is a spokesman for God, and he comes to Eli, and he's basically saying this. He gives him a history. He says, haven't I worked in the past in your family's life? I brought the Israelites out of Egypt. I chose your family, Eli. I chose your inheritance. I mean, your family tree. I chose your heritage, your descendants. All those people. I chose them to be the priests. So God is telling Eli this. Eli, we brought the Israelites out of Egypt. I chose your family to be high priests, and that position has been passed down through the generation. You have been chosen by me specifically, your family. I've blessed your family, and I've met their needs. I've been there for them all these times. And so God is basically saying this. I've done all of this stuff for you. So why would you choose to honor your sons over me? God is making an amazing claim here. God is saying that, and we don't know the heart of Eli, but God does. And so God is saying something. He's saying this. I know your heart, Eli. You worry more about what your sons think than what I think. You're putting your sons higher priority than you're putting me in high priority. So I began to think about this week. Why would Eli do that? Why would Eli put his sons at a higher priority than God? I came up with a list. Maybe you'd have your own. Here are my maybes. Maybe this is why Eli chose to honor his boys or make his boys a priority over God. Maybe he didn't want to confront them. How many of you like to confront people? Yeah. You don't like to be confronted, and oftentimes people don't like to confront people. If you like to confront people, I mean, if that's something you really enjoy, that's a whole other message maybe. But point something out that maybe that they're struggling with. That's not fun, is it? And so maybe that was it. Maybe Eli just didn't want to confront them. Oh, he didn't want to feel. Can I say this? I heard a pastor say this one time. I think everybody needs to write this down and remember that parenting is not a popular is not it should not be your first choice for your kids to like you. Now, it's good if they like you. I mean, I'm not saying don't leave here and say, Pastor says I don't have to like my kids, my parents. That's not what I'm saying either. But I'm just saying this. Sometimes, parents, you're going to have to say things to your kids by setting up these boundaries. You're going to have to say some things to your kids that they're not always going to like. Maybe that was it. Maybe Eli didn't want to confront them. Maybe he didn't want to hurt their feelings. Maybe he didn't want them to get mad. Maybe he just wanted them to like him. Maybe he had his priorities messed up and he thought, I'm too busy working over here with my job. I don't have time because I'm busy with my job, and his priorities are messed up, and he should have been putting more of a priority on his boys. Maybe it was something that was just going to be too difficult, inconvenient. When you know you need to talk to your kids, or you know you need to talk to somebody, you can always find an excuse not to, right? Well, I got to do this. Well, I got to do that. And it's just not convenient. I'm not standing before you and telling you why Eli did it. But God knows he did. Because God says that. Eli, why have you chosen your boys over me? I've done all of this stuff for you. Why have you put your boys' feelings? Why have you put your boys ahead of me? So for whatever reason, Eli has had his priorities messed up. And it's not just a problem of Eli. I think we struggle with that raising our own kids sometimes. I was at a McDonald's a year or so ago, and I saw a dad there with his two little girls. And I started praying for him. Boy, oh boy. Two little girls at McDonald's. And he looked a little frazzled. I don't know if mom was off shopping or mom was somewhere, or I don't know what was going on, but dad was there with the two girls by themselves. And he just had that frazzled, I'm in over my head look as a dad with his two daughters. I've been there before. Brenda would go out of town, and I'd have the two girls. Before we had boys, I'd have the two girls, and I had to get them ready for church one morning. I don't know how to put bows in their hair. I don't know how to do stuff like that. So anyway, I understand what this dad was going through. But these girls were just, they were working their dad. Boy. And they weren't very old. I'm thinking like maybe 8 and 6, 6 and 4, something. I mean, they were little. But the dad was trying to set up boundaries. The little girl he said, what do you want for supper? I want ice cream. He said, well, okay. He goes, we'll do ice cream. But he said, but right now, do you want a hamburger or you want chicken nuggets? What do you want? I want ice cream. And she started screaming, I want ice cream. And so the dad's like, and she's screaming, I want ice cream. And the other little girl's running, ice cream. And all of a sudden, and the dad's like, oh, and he runs over to the counter and he orders 2 ice creams for the girls. And they sit there and they're quiet for a while. And I don't remember what else it was, but it went on like that for a while. It's like every time these girls, this dad all he was basically doing was just doing whatever it took to keep them quiet. Doing whatever it took to make his life at that moment easier, right? That's what he was doing. And I stand convicted of that. I did that. You've probably done it yourself. But in a small way, I think we struggle with that sometimes as we raise our kids, dads, as we raise our boys, as we raise our families. We need to be careful. What was that dad's first priority that day? It was simply pleasing his daughters. Why? So they wouldn't make a scene. Why? So people wouldn't look at him and think, that is a frazzled dad. That's out of control kids. You see, we can be guilty of that with our kids even as they get older. Eli was guilty of that. We're not told why, but for some reason God says, you have put making your boys happy, whatever it is, you don't want to upset them, you want them to like you, whatever, you have put the feelings of your boys ahead of me, God says, and you didn't teach them boundaries. You didn't teach them between right and wrong. And parents, we need to teach our kids there are boundaries. There is right and wrong. There are guidelines to live by, and it's not just so you can make their life miserable. Kids, sometimes we think that, right? That the only reason my parents have rules is to just ruin my life, to make my life miserable. Parents, I hope that's not the only reason. I hope you're setting up biblical boundaries so your kids are safe and they learn that all through life, there are boundaries to live by. So, give consistent godly direction, discipline. Teach complete godly devotion. Your kids need to see that you are completely devoted to God, that God is your number one priority, not them. God. We're going to do what God says we're going to do, even if that doesn't make you happy, kids. And then finally, very quickly, number 3, reveal clear, godly declarations. Now, I said it this way because not only did I want my outline to have all D's, but it's biblical, all right? It's very biblical. In fact, look at begin in verse 30, and we'll read down through verse 34. Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, all right, he goes on, I promise that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me that those who honor me will honor, but those who despise will be despised. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family. And you will be in distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel in your family line, there will never be an old man. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared, only to blind your eyes with tears and to grieve your heart, and all of your descendants will die in the prime of their life. These are not verses you're going to see in a Hallmark card, all right? You're not going to see that. Look at verse 34. And what happens to your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be assigned to you. They will both die on the same day. Very quick summary of what God is saying. He makes some declarations here. Verse 30, very beginning of verse 30. Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares. Very end of verse 30. But now the Lord declares. Here's what God is doing. He's saying, your boys are going to suffer the consequences of their choices. He's saying to Eli, you are going to suffer the consequences, Eli, of the mistakes you made as their dad. There are consequences. That's what these verses basically mean. There are consequences for every choice you make. In verse 35, it talks about, in verse 30, it talks about consequences for doing bad things. And you get to verse 35, look at verse 35. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will be according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. He's saying, basically, I'm going to do away with the house of Eli, and we're going to start over. He said, I'm going to bless this new family. I'm going to bless them because I'm going to pick somebody who's going to live for me. And so, very quick summary. Reveal clear godly declarations to your family. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. Teach your kids there are consequences to everything they do. When they disobey God, there are going to be consequences of disobeying God. When they lower God in priority, Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God. When you lower that priority in your life, when you teach your you have to teach your kids, when they lower the priority of God in their life, there will be consequences for that. But also teach them there are positive consequences. Declare to your children that if you live for God, if you put God first in your life, God will bless your life. That doesn't mean you're not going to have trials, doesn't mean you're going to have hardships, but God will bless you. And so He makes these declarations, and they're very clear. Have you ever noticed when you go to an amusement park and they make all these announcements like at the roller coaster? And they never make, the sound systems are always terrible at amusement parks. Because they always say, they always say, they sound like Charlie Brown's teacher, The only thing that's clear is, or you will surely die. They'll something like, don't do, or you will surely die. And I'm like, wait a minute, what am I not supposed to do? I don't want to die. You think about these are announcements that are being made and they're not clear. You got in this passage, you have an announcement being made. God is making a declaration. This is how you live. These are the boundaries that you live within. When you live within these boundaries, he says, I will bless you. When you step outside of these boundaries and you don't live according to the boundaries I give you, there'll be consequences as well. Parents, dads, give your children godly declarations. This is what God says will happen. If you live an obedient life, God will bless you. So give constant godly discipline, teach complete godly devotion, and reveal clear and godly declarations. I just want to end by reading this. This was in the Quad City Times on Saturday, June 2nd, 2007. The title of, you probably can't see it, the title of this article, it says, Fathers Play a Special Role in Spirituality. I'm not going to read the whole article to you, but I want to just read a couple quotes here. Listen to this. What churches are doing, they've done these studies about churches and families. It says what churches are doing isn't getting the job done. Mom is having to take the kids to church because dad doesn't want to go, said Mark Carrier, co-author with his wife Cynthia of The Values-Driven Family. That leaves mom in charge of the spiritual upbringing of the children, which means faith is a mom thing and not a dad thing. So why is little Johnny, who is 25 and has his first child on the way, whether he's married or not, never in church? The odds are that his father was never in church. It goes on a little further. Surveys found that if father made a decision to become a Christian, the rest of the family followed his example 93% of the time. It seems that when a man takes that kind of spiritual stand, it usually affects everyone else in the whole constellation around him. No one wants to minimize the importance of faithful mothers, he said, but it's clear that fathers play a unique and special role in helping their children develop a living faith, especially their sons. There's no way to deny that. This article basically is a summary of 1 Samuel chapter 2. The dad dropped the ball, and the boys, it was evident by how his boys lived. Dads, we're not perfect. We're never going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. But we need to understand the importance of the three things we saw today. Constant discipline, complete devotion, your godly declarations. Set boundaries for your boys, for your kids, for your children. And 20 or 30 years from now, the faith that you pass on to them will remain strong. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the day. Thank you for the truths of your